series at the Whaling Museum. If you haven't already, please take the time now to silence your cell phones as to not disrupt our presentation today. Thank you so much for supporting this free community program, which is sponsored in part by a grant from the Nantucket Cultural Council, a local agency, which is supported by the Massachusetts Cultural Council, a state agency. We are thrilled to welcome back to Food for Thought demographer Peter Morrison. He was here 2 years ago for a Food for Thought lecture, so we're very excited that he has returned. He tracks demographic trends nationwide and here on Nantucket. Retired from the Rand Corporation in California, he has been a regular seasonal visitor on Nantucket since 1985, and he settled here in 2005. Peter serves on Nantucket's Finance Committee and Energy Study Committee as a director of the Nantucket Shellfish Association. So without further ado, everybody please join me in welcoming Peter Morrison.
Thank you for turning out today in such a lovely venue for a place to spend your noon hour. Today I'm here to do what we demographers specialize in, which is telling you about things that you already know, but with very great precision. My field of demography intersects several disciplines, academic disciplines, sociology, economics, geography, statistics, public health, and applied demographers, which is the kind of demographer that I am, typically use demographic data and concepts to address tangible problems with a focus more on using knowledge rather than advancing it. And we're often engaged in forecasting something, or at least trying to foresee what might be in store in the future. When we talk about the future, we regularly use a versatile concept which we term a cohort. A cohort is a group of people who share some common demographic experience at some point in time, such as being born in a particular year, or having graduated from school in a particular year, marrying in a particular year, having immigrated to the United States in a particular year, or naturalized in a particular year. And if you think of Tom Brokaw's book entitled The Greatest Generation, that is a book about a demographic cohort that came of age during the Great Depression. So the demographer's concept of a cohort is really just a generalization of what we ordinarily regard as a generation, but it has a fairly specific meaning in a number of different contexts, and we also are able to place measures on cohorts and track them across time. For example, you'll see here a cohort that some of you may recognize, which is a recent graduating class of Nantucket High School. So that's a cohort that we will track over time and see how their lives unfold, and we could compare them with a cohort that graduated 20 or 30 years earlier and ask how did their lives unfold and how does this unfolding process change over time. So the way we foresee the future in my field, rather than building black box models, is we track cohorts over time into the future. We account for additions and subtractions through births and deaths, and we watch how the population has changed as migrants or immigrants come and go. So my topic today is population aging, and this is probably the most consequential and visible global demographic shift in our future. Population aging stems from two long-term trends, the first of which is that everybody's living longer, and secondly, the universal trend that couples are choosing to have fewer children. Population aging is a central aspect of the future that carries with it broad macroeconomic implications, which means it changes how our economy, it transforms how our economy works. And it also has fiscal consequences which play out nationally, which most of us are vaguely familiar with, but also play out locally in diverse ways. And we're seeing that begin to happen here on Nantucket. So let me turn to each of these trends that is inducing global aging. First of all, people living longer. Here we see the trend for the mid-1950s and going through 2010 and projected into mid-century. That's going from left to right. And what we're looking at here is life expectancy at birth for the United States, for Europe, China, and India. Now you see for the US, which is the green line on the top, the average length of life has risen from 69 years in 1955 to 78 years today. And by mid-century, the average newborn in the United States will have 83 years of life ahead. Moving down to the next line, which is just below the US, in blue, Europe, you can see a very similar trend, and this is so for a number of the advanced industrialized countries that life expectancy is tracking about where we are, and in all cases is heading up, except in Russia, where people are drinking their brains out. If you look at China now, shown in red, it's interesting that newborns in 1965 had a life expectancy of only about 45 years, whereas today's newborn in China has a life expectancy of 73 years. Now that's a life that has increased by 28 years just since 1965. You take, do the subtraction there, it's getting close to an additional year for every calendar year that passes. India is the brown line, and along the bottom it shows a parallel rise over past decades projected into the future. So the message in these data is clear. In developing countries, people who once lived only into their mid-40s will typically survive into their 70s. And in advanced industrialized nations, we'll typically live into our mid-80s. The second factor that I mentioned, behind aging, is the universal trend toward having fewer children. And here I'm showing you the trend in the total fertility rate, which is an analytic measure that demographers calculate. And you can think of it as the average number of children a woman would bear over the course of her reproductive life if she bore children at today's rates at every age. So it kind of compresses it all together, puts you through the rates, and says, well, if today's world stays the same and you live in today's world for the rest of your life, that's how many children there will be. So it's a useful analytic measure because it implies what today's rates will result in over the future. Now you'll see that for China, in red, the average woman was still bearing 5 or 6 children as recently as the 1960s. The very high fertility in China at that time, despite the fact that there was widespread famine due to the Great Leap Forward, corresponded well with Mao's political dogma that a huge population would increase China's military, economic, and political power. This high fertility caused the enormous population increase that we now have in modern China and is now responsible for what is a huge momentum that is built into China's age structure. And you'll see in a moment what I mean by momentum. It's as close as we get to demography as destiny. Now, what happened afterward with China was, if you look at the 1970 that's highlighted here, you'll see a very, very steep decline in childbearing over a very short period of time. And this corresponds to the imposition of China's one-child population policy, so that by the early 1990s, China's total fertility rate had dropped below 2.1 children per woman, which is what we usually regard as replacement level fertility, which means that the population will eventually stabilize at a fixed number rather than grow or decline over the long term. Now, if you just compare the overall patterns here, looking at the wide differences that once existed among countries back in the 1960s, and how similar they are today, encompassing a range of just 1.6 to 2.5 births per woman, there's a very clear message here, and I could show you a number of other countries where you'd see the same trend. The fact is that there are fewer children everywhere. Now let's consider how population aging materializes. It materializes through that process I mentioned earlier of cohort progression, and that is a highly predictable process. We can project that out for a half a century or more with a high degree of confidence in what's going to happen. Now, I'm going to show you an animation of how the process will play out for China, where we have the added twist of China's restrictive one-child policy coming into play as well. So just kind of watch the pattern. Here we have the age distribution of China's population in 1955, and you'll see the broader base at the very bottom corresponds to the large proportion of children under age 10. This is like a layer cake with the infants on the bottom and the elderly on the top. Now watch how history unfolds over successive 5-year intervals. This is 1955, this is 1960, 1965, 1970. Look at all those youngsters. 1975, 1980. Now we are seeing the effects of the one-child policy, and this has engraved a permanent deficit in the age distribution of China's population. There's nothing you can do to change this, where you see those blue arrows. And as that indentation progresses over time, we're now up to 1995, we reach a point as of 2010 where you can see what used to be a pyramid is now looking like a very large bulge of people who are growing older, and it doesn't look like there are quite as many youngsters who are going to enter the working ages to pay for their retirement or health care. And then with the yellow arrow, we start to see what is probably the echo effect of the one-child family policy playing out. And as we extend this further to 2025, 30, 35, 40, this is starting to look like a population in which most of the people are elderly, and there aren't enough people of working age to necessarily support them. So it is such a fundamental structural transformation that there really is nothing you can tinker with that is going to get rid of that fundamental structural difference. Now let me show you how this is playing out in the U.S. At least we don't have a one-child family policy mandated, but here you can see the baby boom generation in 1975, and then to the right in 2000, 2025, and 2050. So we have the same sort of thing going on. A lot of people growing older and reaching the elderly ages, and kind of somewhat of a deficit of people of working age. So the other thing that you want to understand here is that while all of this is happening, remember that people are going to be living longer. And in this slide, what I've done is shown you compared the Social Security Trustees report as of 2008, which is in blue, they decided in 2013 they wanted to revisit their demographic assumptions, and they decided that they thought it looked like people were going to live a bit longer than they had thought 5 years earlier. So you kind of have an oops moment here where you have 1.3 to 1.5 more years of life expectancy than was thought in 2008. So that's kind of what's going on as the future unfolds and we find out that demography is changing in certain ways. Now, what are the consequences of population aging? Obviously, the one consequence is an increasing proportion of people 65 and over. And what I've shown here is just the upward trend for 5 world regions: Europe, North America, Latin America, Asia, and Africa. It's happening everywhere, although different regions are at different stages, but things are moving up. If you look at 8 high-income countries, the United States is the heavy black line. Our shares are going up, but other countries are experiencing a more sudden rise. Japan stands out in particular. Japan is a country where aging has been advancing more quickly than any advanced industrialized nation. Here's a little more detail on the U.S. The percentage, the rising share of the population in the 3 age groups: 65 and over, 75 and over, and 85 and over. And as you can see, in each of these groups, we're having a rising share of population. So as this era progresses, other things are going to change. It's not just these dry statistics that are going up. What we're going to find is that we're going to see the more frequent emergence of what we call the 2-generation geriatric family, in which you have somebody in their 90s who may need care, but that care would be given by an adult daughter who might be in her mid-70s. Not always feasible. So that's one outcome of population aging. We can quantify some of these transformations with certain measures. Here is one that I like, which is called the parent support ratio. And this is a useful metric which relates cohorts of persons who are 80 and older in a population to cohorts who are 50 to 64 years old, those who are likely to be their children, or at least of their children's age. And as you can see, this is a metric that has gone up a bit, and where we are right now is poised just a few years before there's going to be a very sharp rise in that pink line for the U.S. And you can see in China, it was kind of flattening out, and it's going to rise as well. So one way to think about this is that for every 100 of us in our 50s and early 60s, how many persons 80 and older, our parents, may be alive and in need of our assistance? And you can see that that is going to kind of double in a very short period of time, a few decades. So as the population ages, an increasing proportion of its members are going to have difficulty performing certain functions which we call activities of daily living. This is a standard metric that people in various fields use to talk about what happens as you enter a stage of life where you may have some difficulty with certain tasks, such as taking care of yourself in terms of bathing, toileting, eating, and dressing. That would be an activity of daily living. And what you see with the blue curve here is the percentage of people today who have a difficulty with one or more ADL, which is an activity of daily living. Now, the ADL itself in blue is usually regarded as a measure of fairly severe disability in old age, one which predicts the need for personal care services and residence in a nursing facility for long-term care. Also shown on this chart is another key metric in red, which is called the instrumental activities of daily living, IADL. And these are tasks that are associated with the capacity to live independently, such as cooking, shopping, managing finances, using communication devices. And these measures are more predictive of a need for assistance, such as a homemaker or home health assistance. So these data show the proportions of the population that needs help with at least one such activity, either the kind of activity that is best met in a continuing care or nursing home facility. And the one in red is the one that is, if we could provide some help at home, this person might be able to continue living independently. And I want to focus your attention just on the red curve, and especially on the right, where we see a fifth to a third of people who are essentially long on life expectancy, but they may find themselves short on help where it counts most in old age, at home. Some of these individuals may be widowed. Others may represent the older generation of a two-generation geriatric family, say a 95-year-old daughter with her 75-year-old, a 95-year-old individual with a 75-year-old child, both of them having some presence on the red curve, neither in a position to easily care for the other. And so the message here is that mitigating the red curve, however much we can, and obviously we can't mitigate it all, but if we can take a bit out of that red curve or mitigate a bit of it, that's where the opportunities lie going forward, not only nationally but here locally. So it's a way of thinking about how do we want to intervene with a finite amount of resources in what is going to unfold here as well as across the nation and really across the world. The more we're able to place a range of supportive services within reach of family members, the longer our elderly can live independently. And I'll give you one final metric from the Institute of Medicine, which dramatizes the massive cost implications here. It's been estimated that if it were possible to postpone by 1 month the onset of disability that leads to an elderly person being placed in a nursing home, guess what the resulting savings would total nationwide? You're going to prolong independent living for 1 more month, and how much do you think it would save? Raise your hand. Take a guess. $3 billion nationwide. So it invites the question, would $3 billion help us postpone by a month that transition among most elderly or some elderly? How does that cost out? I don't know what the calculation is. Let me touch briefly on some of the fiscal effects of aging. As most of you know, we foresee a steady decline ahead in the number of workers who will be paying into Social Security. And here are the data that make that point. You can see on the left, or the second from the left, 1990, well over 3.4 workers per beneficiary. Today, 2010, roughly speaking, under 3. And by 2030, you've got 2.2 workers per beneficiary. So the message here is that the federal government is going to have to wring more dollars out of fewer workers going forward. That's an inevitable aspect of this. Here's what the Social Security Trustees Annual Report envisions. Blue is surplus, red is deficit, the line is today. You kind of running along, coasting along, and eventually you run out of fuel if you don't make any adjustments. Behind this glacier-like threat that's on the horizon, we can identify some potential trade-offs that could blunt, if not mitigate, what's in store. I find it interesting to consider historically how our lifespan has been divided up among 3 major stages of life. At the bottom, not working; in the middle, working for pay; and at the top, being retired. The green line at the top shows that we have enjoyed a steadily increasing number of years that we have to apportion across these 3 stages, from 70.1 in 1960 to 78.1 today, and we anticipate having a budget of 85 years that we can apportion by mid-century. And I think just visually you can see that we're spending relatively more of our lives in the retirement stage. And that's something that can be seen as personally beneficial. It can also be seen as nationally unaffordable. Two ways of looking at it. I'm going to show you a more refined metric which gets at what we really want to recognize here, which is the years we spend in retirement expressed as a percentage of the years we spend earning income. That's the blue line at the top. And then the red line, you can see the years we spend in retirement expressed as a percentage of all the years we're alive. So whichever way you look at it, these percentages are projected to rise over time. And it poses the question, as a nation, can we afford this luxury? Perhaps it is what we want to do. I have not yet been presented with that choice by any elected official. So, what's to be done? Population aging is a very gradual process. The social and economic challenges that it poses just don't attract the immediate focused attention of the policy process. And what we're seeing in Washington now is the beginnings of how that unfolds. And we have no history on which to base a prediction of how our system of government will handle something, will handle cans that can be kicked down the road for a few months forever. Let me share with you I hesitate to characterize it as the grim reality, but it is a grim reality, directly from the distinguished committee of the National Academy of Sciences that has released a report on this in the last year or so. And I offer it to you because it offers us a framework for discussion nationally and locally as well about what really our options might be. And the options really are to consume less, to work more, or to come up with some combination of both. The National Academy identifies 4 basic approaches for adapting to this new economic landscape that's created by aging population and for providing the resources to support consumption in later years so that we don't all grow old and become poor, which can happen now in some Asian societies. The first option is that workers can save more and consume less in order to prepare better for their own retirement. That's the defined contribution plan that has replaced the defined benefit plan. Workers can pay higher taxes, thereby consuming less, to finance benefits for older people, which is more of an aggregate, workers as a whole helping out elderly as a whole. So it's kind of a transfer from one group to another, or from one generation to another is what it really is. Third option, benefits and hence consumption for older people can be reduced to bring them in line with current tax and savings rates. We just say, we got a budget, this is all we can give you. Social Security is going to have to shrink as in order to reduce those deficits, and every year you'll be getting not an adjustment for inflation, but an adjustment for not deflation, an adjustment for having less money. And the final option is that people can work longer and retire later, raising their own earnings and, in the process, raising national output. I find it a sobering recognition that our Congress is incapable of making such choices. And that is perhaps the most troubling aspect of this, because these really are the options, and we got to get down to the business of choosing among them and somehow coming up with a combination that works. An important implication here, I think, is that the nation needs to rethink its outlook and policies about working and retirement. Age at retirement, it turns out, is central to population aging and its economic consequences. And if we raise retirement ages, as we have to some extent so far, but perhaps not enough, we have an alternative to reducing the consumption of leisure and enhancing people's ability to stretch their assets over lifetimes, and perhaps bring the portion of our life that we spend in retirement into a more stable balance with the portion we spend in our working years, rather than spending allocating more of our years to retirement. Having said that, it is a grim outlook, and I'm reminded of the story about the 95-year-old curmudgeon who had just had his annual physical exam. Doctor, he asked, if I were to stop smoking and cut out all my drinking and abstain from any sexual activity, do you think I can live to be 100? And the doctor thought for a moment, and he said, no, but it will feel like you have. Which leads me to the topic on which I'll conclude today, which is exceptional longevity, people living to be 100 or beyond. Not because centenarians will become more numerous in the future, but because these rare individuals among us today who've reached 100 are now affording us some fascinating new scientific insights into just what makes for exceptional longevity. In the past few decades, researchers, both in my own field of demography and in a number of other fields, have painstakingly assembled large databases on this rare phenomenon. They've gone out and collected data on thousands of centenarians and centenarians' siblings and background information on these people. And the payoff to these efforts is that we're beginning to isolate statistically some of the causal factors that are conducive to exceptional longevity. And as with the Genome Project, we're gaining a fuller understanding of the various mechanisms by which a few of us dodge so many bullets for so long in life. Just for some context, centenarians represent the fastest growing age group in the industrialized countries. There are very few of them, but they're growing very rapidly. Nationwide, there are 53,364 centenarians, as of April 1st, 2010, according to the census, and there will be 168,000 as of 2030, which is about a threefold increase. Here on Nantucket, we've got 162 people who are queuing up to become centenarians. They're 85 and older. And from my sources on island as of today, there are 3 centenarians on Nantucket. And I wonder if any of you are in the audience today, if you would raise your hand. 3 is going to become around 10 by the year 2030. So that's kind of what's in store. But what's really interesting is to ask the question, what are these centenarians revealing to us about extraordinary old age and the increasing chances that we will reach these advanced ages? And just to cater to those of you who have a scientific bent, here are some interesting research factoids. Obviously, we all know parental longevity is the strongest predictor. Centenarians run in families, and it also turns out that birth order matters. Being first born in a large family shows through statistically as increasing your odds of reaching 100. If you were raised in the rural West, it's a further plus. And lastly, and most interesting, is season of birth. If you were born in September, October, November, you have a statistically significant greater likelihood of reaching 100. So if you're a fall baby, the first child of a farming couple from Boise, and you ask, is it a safe bet that I'll make it to 100? Should I go home and pop a bottle of champagne after Morrison stops talking? And the answer is no. These are, with the exception of the first one, these are very weak effects. It's not going to unfold in your life in any way that it's going to be discernible. But the value here lies in pinpointing the directions in which we will find fruitful scientific relationships. That is to say, it's a source of forming hypotheses about what else is going on beside genetics. Now, I'll show you, just to follow up on this point about the season of birth. A very interesting study that was done in which they took centenarians and they said, okay, we know you've reached 100, but we want to look at your siblings at a particular point, age 50. And we want to do a statistical analysis on a large sample of the siblings of centenarians to see what it is that affects their probability of, or their odds of reaching 100 eventually. So you've got the centenarians, and then you've got their siblings when they were 50, and you're going to see how many of them reach 100. So what you've implicitly done is you've controlled on those family factors. They have the common effect of parental longevity, or lack thereof, and then you still see, as you saw with the centenarians, you see in the siblings of the centenarians a statistically significant, somewhat higher odds of reaching 100. So you think about that, why could being born in the fall make any difference in the odds of both a centenarian and the sibling of a centenarian reaching 100? What's going on here? Well, it turns out that the season of birth effects on longevity point to influences of very early life events and conditions. Seasonal exposure to infections, nutritional deficiencies that may occur more at one time of the year than another, and some other factors, all of which are known to have an influence on survival. So what it looks like is that month of birth is really a proxy for things that are happening possibly in utero and during early infancy development. So it points scientific research in that direction to find out what is it about September, October, November that is somewhat more protective of these effects. I'm going to close on what's in store locally just with some thoughts. We've seen the big picture. Now what about the local onset of aging on Nantucket? We're going to see more elderly residents striving to live independently as they age in place. That's a certainty. We are going to have more two-generation geriatric families emerging among us. There's going to be an expanding need for supportive services and assistance to help sustain independent living. And finally, I'll tell you there will be some choices that the community will face. One choice will be deciding on cost-effective modes of service delivery and who's going to be involved in delivering these services. The other aspect of this is achieving economies of scale so we can deliver these services efficiently. I don't know who's going to deliver them, and the arrangements that we make are going to be choices that we make as a community, and communities around the country are going to make them because the federal government delivers dollars, but it doesn't deliver care. So this is going to be worked out at the local level. Here's a profile of Nantucketers 75 and over, just to give you a picture of where we stand today. And I've shown you a comparison here from 2000 to 2010 over the 10-year period that we have data from the decennial census where we have a full count of people. And what you can see is we got about an even split among 75-year-olds between those who are living alone and those who are not living alone. They have somebody else in the household. If anything, the living alone portion has increased just slightly by 1 percentage point. So this is what we have out there today, about an even split. And the question is, how is this going to unfold going forward, and what do we want to do about it? So I'll sum up by leaving you with this thought. Nantucket is a microcosm of demographic changes that are occurring across the nation, indeed occurring across the world. We're growing older, we are in a strong community, and we are within extended families. I think that is an aspect that not all communities can boast. And secondly, population aging is going to intensify local service and assistance needs, and we should recognize that access to these supportive services and assistance can help sustain independent living as Nantucketers age, and in the process, save a bundle of dollars. So I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions. I think we have some time.
Anybody have any questions for Peter Morrison?
You mentioned the ratio between people working and no longer working. What's the impact of this continuing high level of youth unemployment? Youth starting work later and having much higher unemployment rates?
Well, it's pretty clear that one effect it's having, which is a short-term effect, is that there are fewer dollars flowing into the Social Security system. And it's not a good thing to have a generation that remains unemployed for a prolonged period of time, which you have in some countries around the world, some countries in the Middle East. I mean, it's just, it amplifies the underlying structural problem demographically, because the folks who are supposed to be the source of the money that's going to support the elderly are not generating that money, and insofar as we don't solve that problem, we've got a further exacerbating factor on our hands.
Could you address, I have a couple of questions that are related. Populations with Alzheimer's are rising as people continue to get older, and we're seeing more dementia and Alzheimer's and so forth. And we also have a growing population of people in veterans' hospitals as a result of the wars and so forth.
Right.
And we're keeping people alive longer. So how, in terms of the national requirement to support these people, because obviously they can't support themselves, how does that figure into these needs?
Simple answer is it makes the situation worse from a financial perspective. And it really presents us with some very difficult choices that we have to make between how fully we want to honor commitments that have been made in the past, for example, to veterans, and shrinking numbers of dollars that are available that are, for which there are competing needs among the elderly, among people with Alzheimer's, among people with, war-related diseases. How do you make those choices? It really would be a lot easier if we were back in the 1950s, because these problems would be beneath the surface, and we could say, well, we'll just spread the dollars around and we can solve most of all the problems. And, well, these are choices. These pose really difficult choices. Every society has to deal with this. The Eskimos, as I recall, dealt with it by, when a person had reached a certain age where they really no longer were going to survive much longer, they would voluntarily walk out on the iceberg and just die by themselves. That's an extreme choice, an extreme variant of how a society would adapt to something like this. I don't think it's in the cards for us.
I noticed that one of the possible solutions for this problem, and it wasn't mentioned, was increased immigration. Now, of course, that would involve us stealing young people from other poorer countries, but is that a possibility?
Very definitely, and it's not stealing. Immigration for the United States has a very strong positive aspect to it, because the people that we attract are the self-selected strivers from across the world, and I'm sure you're familiar with the statistics that show that immigrants have been responsible for more patents and more Silicon Valley companies being founded, way out of proportion to their presence in the population. So immigration is a good thing. You cannot view it as a permanent solution in the sense that the immigrants themselves will grow older and need to be dealt with as the next generation. But it'll get you through a few centuries. It'll get you through a few centuries as long as you assume the population can continue to grow, and you're not looking at the world the way China was, saying we've got too many people here, we need to put a halt to this growing population phenomenon. But yes, immigration offers a really nifty interim solution, where interim is defined as maybe 30 to 50 years into the future.
Hi, Peter. Phil Stambach. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Could you go back to that chart where the 4 solutions or 4 possible choices?
Sure. It's not too far back here, I know that.
It's quite a ways back. The reason I want to go back there is I spent probably the 20 years before I came to Nantucket in the defined contribution business. I was on the board of the National Defined Contribution Council. And with the various companies I worked for, Fidelity, Cigna, Scudder, Stevens and Clark, et cetera, spent a lot of time trying to convince workers to save more or to save something. And it's, there's a small percentage that actually will do that. So I don't think number 1's ever going to work. But let me go back down. Let me look at number 4 is about the only thing that probably will work. People work longer and retire later, raising their earnings and national output. One of the things, going back to the defined contribution side, is that companies have gotten rid of their defined benefit plans. In other words, they're not saving for the employees, and that's probably never going to come back.
Yeah, you're on your own, buddy.
You're on your own, exactly. And so they should, but they don't. So you kind of go back to Social Security in that other chart where you showed surplus and you showed deficit. The problem with the Social Security system, or the way you could change Social Security, put it this way, it's a pay-as-you-go system. But the money comes in, and they pay the money out, and the surplus goes into the national treasury to be used to pay the government's expenses. If they treated it like a defined benefit plan, where they actually put the money into the Social Security Trust Fund, which is the way they describe it, but they don't do it, then we would be saving money that we could invest, and then we might have more money for retirees later. But it's a choice that the government won't make, because it means cutting something else out somewhere else if they're not going to be able to use this money. But the politicians don't seem to want to face it.
Yeah, a couple of comments on that. The problem with Social Security as it now exists is we can never get from here to where we would have liked to have been as a fully funded system instead of pay-as-you-go. If we had started it at the time that way, which would have been really a heroic effort given the historical circumstances, we wouldn't be where we are now. One other comment I have on the first point, I fully agree with you that the 4th point here is probably the only realistic option, and you can get a lot of leverage out of it. It's just politically very, very difficult, although not impossible. But on the first point, there's some interesting research that has developed about, you're in charge of your own retirement, buddy, you better start saving. And the field of behavioral economics has come up with some nifty solutions. Up until recently, it used to be the case that, there was that 401k plan. You took the job and they said, well, we have a 401k plan. Did you want to sign up for it? if you do, you got to fill out the paperwork and do it. The behavioral nudge that is now being given to that is, oh, you're a new employee. You're signed up for the 401k plan. They're going to take out, tiny bit, and it's going to help for your retirement. But, if you want to opt out of that, we've got some paperwork here you can fill out. And the studies of this have shown that most of the people stay in, whereas before, hardly any of them signed up. So behavioral economics can do a lot in terms of nudges to get people to do things or to sign them up for things and allow them to opt out if they really don't want to. Right. It's a good start on a retirement plan. Well, right. And remember, Social Security, a lot of people don't realize it. Social Security is not for your retirement. Its original purpose was to prevent you from falling into severe poverty in old age. And that's all it's meant to be. It's not meant to be the check that you get at the end of every month at your Florida condominium before you go out to dinner and drinks. That's not what Social Security was. But we all think of it that way.
Peter, while we have that slide on, number 4, you said, that may be the most realistic way of helping to solve the problem. But it seems to me that goes sort of back to John Merson's earlier question, that it's kind of squeezing the sausage. If you let people or encourage people to work longer and contribute to the system, you're also occupying potential working places for younger people to come in. And you're sort of increasing the unemployment at the younger level, unless you constantly keep adding so many working slots in the economy that it can cover both the young people coming in and letting the older people work longer. So I just don't see that as a realistic solution as long as we're not growing a lot more than we're doing.
Well, that last phrase, growing a lot more, is the key to this problem. Actually, there's a misperception that there's a fixed number of jobs. I can't remember what the economists call it. Somebody in the audience may remember. It's like the fixed something or other. And most economists will tell you that there isn't a fixed number of jobs. The number of jobs is very much a function of how well the economy is running and on how many pistons. So you can envision an economy that is in healthy shape, that is generating ever more jobs, such that young people are not being displaced by elderly people who are staying in the job too long. And what you're really doing, if you encourage people rather than mandate them to stay in the workforce, if you encourage people to stay in the workforce, what you're doing is you're rebalancing the way the economy works and the way it's delivering retirement benefits to those who do retire, and you're implicitly making fuller use of human capital insofar as people are making willing decisions to stay in the workplace, as people like myself have done. I have a great job at the airport. It now pays me $12 an hour, and I tell all my colleagues out there when we park planes, I said, that check you get at the end of the month? They take out all that Social Security money. I said, that goes right into my pocket. And I said, I'm still earning $12 an hour. So they laugh at it. They get a joke out of it. But really, it's a misperception to think that a person who stays in a job one more year is preventing another young person from filling a job. It's, what you said is definitely true of academia. I don't dispute that at all, but it's not true of the economy as a whole. There will be parts of the economy where this is very much of an effect, and getting tenure today is nothing like what it was like 30 or 40 years ago. I mean, there aren't any jobs, and if you get a job, your chances of getting tenure are far less than they would have been in the 1960s or 70s. But that's just within one sector of the economy. But it's not true that it applies to all the sectors. There will be these instances where that does create roadblocks, no question about it.
And I have a question back here, and then I'll come back up to the front.
Hi, Peter. Great job. Two quick observations, the second of which leads to a question. On your Chinese population charts, don't go back to them, but if you look at 1995, clearly there are more males than females. One of the side, perhaps unintended consequences of the one child. Does that have an impact for the future population of China in that it's a smaller share of the population that's childbearing?
Very definitely, and I'll share with you afterward an op-ed piece that I did with a colleague who's an authority on the Chinese population called The Bachelor Bomb, which is, basic story is that there can be a whole lot of males in China who can't find wives. Part of it is because of female infanticide and termination of pregnancies. And there is very definitely a gender imbalance. There's a lot more young men than women in China, and a lot of them aren't going to get married unless they go abroad.
And they're going to have a heck of a burden looking
They're going to have a heck of a burden, and the talk ranges from, gee, maybe they can be, they'll be great fodder for an army to go out and engage in all sorts of bad things. Maybe
Peter, my second observation, which Chris will share, he worked in Indiana, I worked in Missouri. The maximum number of college-age or college-participating people occurred in 2010, 2008 to 2010. The implication for that we see with the collapse of some of the private institutions of higher education that were trying to get a hold of the people who couldn't get into university. Now they can get into university, and you look at the paper, and we see that this little outfit is shutting down, that little outfit is shutting down. Now, to add to this, Japan had a 40% decline in the college-going population in the last decade. And the question then is, can we look at Japan to see how they've handled their aging population? Are there any clues as to how they've dealt with it politically, governmentally, economically? Because they're ahead of us in this curve.
They're ahead of us demographically, and I would say the clues that derive from the Japanese experience are pretty much clues about what not to do. They've done a number. In Japan, there have been a lot of things that weren't done or were done wrong to not only perpetuate or prolong, but to intensify the problem. Japan, as you probably know, has had a long tradition of lifelong employment, and that was unsustainable going forward. And then came the shock of people in their 60s who thought that they were going to be employed for another 5 years. They were thrown out with a Monday trash. So there are some lessons about what not to do. And I'm not sure that I can point to any country where there are some nifty lessons about what to do, but when you analyze the problem as opposed to ask yourself what is politically feasible, the latter of which I have no particular abilities to do, there are some solutions, but there are tough choices, and there are things you can do, there are adjustments you can make, but you can't kick the can down the road. You have to make them, and you have to have the political will to do it.
Peter, there seems to be a lot of talk lately about extending the limit. I should think that there would be more
Well, I think there are a number of different ways, another number of different formats that you can envision. One format is to have everybody in one place. You can call it whatever you will, a nursing home or whatever. Another format is to say we have a residential facility where, I guess they call them continuing care facilities. I'm not too familiar with all the alternatives, but the point I'm trying to make here is that there are people who are living at home. They can make some retrofits so they don't have to walk up the stairs, or they can, deal with that problem. But they only need a little help to stay living at home, and that's almost invariably the cheaper alternative. And then the interesting thing that you see developing in some older cities where population has been declining as people move away, and you have elderly people becoming more concentrated through a process of subtraction because they stay while their children leave. Think of places like Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, actually Levittown, New York on Long Island would be the best example. And you end up with a community where everybody settled sort of all at once after World War II, and then you find that there's a whole lot of people all living in the same neighborhood. They're all elderly, they're living in their homes, they're within blocks of each other, or they're all within a few apartment buildings. Children are off somewhere else. You say, well, this is a naturally occurring retirement community. How about retrofitting it with a service infrastructure? So you have communal dining, you have, the visiting nurse, whatever else it is. So aging in place and what we call naturally occurring retirement communities are an interesting model that occurs autonomously and provides an opportunity. Provides a real business opportunity for those who want to provide it, because you have built in the economies of scale. Everybody's in one area. We don't have a naturally occurring retirement community in Nantucket, and even if we did, the data are too thin to detect it. But there are probably some blocks in town where there are more elderly than others in the in-town area. And so if you ask, well, Meals on Wheels, if you can hit 80% of those people within a 20 square block area, maybe there's some economies of scale there. That's how we could think of that.
Perfect. Oh, we got one more over here, and then I think this will be the last one, and if you have any further questions, please feel free to see Peter after the presentation.
As you say, immigration is going to be one of the solutions to this. How much more would the country have to have before it had a meaningful result in some of the problems they're outlining here? And is the government factoring in this data when they decide how many people to allow in?
I don't know exactly what the numbers would be, but you could think along two dimensions. One would be just, let a lot more people who want to immigrate and let them become productive workers. Another would be to adopt a policy that's more like what I guess Australia and I think Canada use, which is their emphasis is on selecting the most productive individuals who want to immigrate, whereas our policies are heavily weighted with the family members, so that if you are here and you're an immigrant, your 40 or 50 or 60 or 70-year-old family members who are still back in some other country kind of get toward the head of the line, and they may be nearing retirement age rather than be the most productive people. So again, you have some policy choices. If you want to get the most out of immigration, what you want to do is you want to say, we're looking for the self-selected strivers of the world. We'd like you to be under 45 years of age. If you happen to have $10 million and you want to start a business here, even better, head to the front of the line. That's how you wring the most out of immigration. That'd be a great solution. Engineering and science. Yeah, I mean, these are all there are ways to fix this problem, but you got to change some of the entrenched interests that are out there right now. But it's not an impossible fix. And the nifty thing to me, looking at everything in terms of theoretically, don't ask me if it actually works in practice, just does it work in theory? There are some interesting theoretical solutions to the problem. So thank you very much. If you have any other questions, I'll be right here.